Hello everyone. Hopefully you can see and hear me all right. Hopefully. Thanks very much for making the session. I think on today's session we've got lots of returners. So people have been to previous sessions, but if you've not been before, hello, welcome. My name's Ben. I'm from a company called Rare Consulting. So we're a research and product development company. And today I'm going to be taking you through some of the latest findings from our coronavirus consumer tracker research. If you're new to GoToWebinar, I mean, obviously you've been to these before, you'll now hopefully have a working knowledge of it. Any questions or thoughts you've got, feelings, whatever you like, chuck them into the questions box on your control panel. Generally, I'd say probably best to just, as we go through, just pop your questions in. In terms of timings, this should take roughly 50 minutes. So give or take a bit of waffle here or there. So if you want to, stick your questions in as we go, then go for it. So in terms of what we're going to be covering in today's session, so I'm going to be taking you through a little bit about the background to the project for those of you new to these sessions, some context that I think is quite important for this week that we're seeing on a kind of macro level, and then I'm going to take you through some of the key themes for this week, and we're starting to see very much some kind of almost like habit formation that we're seeing in the data, which I think is quite difficult sometimes to predict in circumstances like this, but we're certainly seeing some consistency with the data over the last few weeks. And then we're going to be going through the different sectors. So I'll talk to you about grocery, alcohol, retail, beauty, DIY and home management, and exercise. So plenty to cover. In terms of what we're doing, we are doing three things concurrently, where we're tracking changes in the consumer market, but also looking at how people are feeling and how they're responding to the pandemic. We've also got a brand reputation tracker where we measure how different brands are perceived across different categories. So I've got an update on that this week. And our diary studies, and that's our kind of qualitative view. So you kind of get all the macro tracker data, and with these diary studies, we're able to see, what is it that people are actually, what is it they're really doing at the time they've got. And in these sessions, we give them a task for a week, and they tell us how they spend their time each day. So we've done them in entertainment and finance, and we've seen the kind of richness around how people are planning their time, spending their time, and their various attitudes towards the current situation. So thanks for your input. These are just those of you who've been on these sessions, you'll be familiar with how we kind of run them. But in the registration form, I ask you, what are you looking forward to in these sessions? And this is just a bit of an update in terms of the types of questions we have. I couldn't fit them all onto the slide. I just had to kind of use the space that was made available to me, I'm afraid. But as you can see, it's interesting to see the kind of consistencies that are coming through. The word change is used a lot in here. Habit is used a lot as well. We've got some people down here just interested in everything, like a kind of information sponge. So hopefully we'll cover off some of everything as best as we can. In terms of some of the important context that we've seen this week. This week's been, it's probably been less of the sort of big headlines in the business community. Obviously, we've had furlough schemes been now implemented, the bounce back loans have been passed around, and seemingly seem to be going okay. But this week there's some quite important updates. So we've seen, for those who are self-employed, 2 million of them have reached out to get more help. And at the same time, this week, there was an announcement from the Bank of England that said that £34.1 billion worth of loans had been advanced to firms during March, which is the highest figure since records began in 1991. So clearly, for businesses, borrowing is up, and depending on circumstances, this funding will either be used to solve short-term problems, or be looking at kind of longer term investment considerations. And this is really important to bear in mind, because it will have a huge impact on businesses in terms of their cash availability and ongoing costs. Then there's a kind of interesting paradox in a way, that whilst businesses are borrowing more in the consumer markets, what we're actually seeing is that the people who, in terms of accessing new credit, that's dropped 0.3% year on year in March over the same time period. And of course, that's the first time that's happened. It's been a big shift. So clearly, people feel less able to access, or less willing to access credit during a time like this. And obviously, in some sectors, for a lot of consumers, their access to credit is really important for them to be able to to exist day to day. So it has a huge consequences of that, I guess, are a little bit unknown at the moment. But the implications could be quite huge over time. So sort of a paradox, I guess, of companies borrowing more and consumers borrowing less over this period. We've also had the announcement of the points-based immigration bill went through the first stage in the House of Commons. I've put this in here as being important for the context, because certainly for retail and hospitality, this is going to be a major issue for lots of companies in terms of finding staff to help operate their enterprises. And coincide with this, as you know, for those who've been in these sessions before, we're measuring the level of compliance with the government rules. And this week we've seen roughly 1 in 5 people claiming they're no longer abiding by the instructions given by the government. So there's sort of a real problem that's now existing with lots of people saying, you know what, I'm not going to abide by these principles. In some cases, they will be in circumstances where they're unable to because of work. But in other cases, it will be for other more attitudinal reasons. The impact of this, of course, could be quite considerable. Be it thinking about the negative effect of the second wave that we're all concerned about, and the time taken to return to some sense of normality. So that's, I don't want to kind of go over all the kind of negative stuff necessarily, but certainly these are really important themes, really important things, I think, to be conscious of at a macro level. There are those, I think, some positives forward. So when we've been doing these webinars, and we've had hundreds of people each week attending them, what I found really quite heartening is just how many people are now in a situation where they're accessing information, they're coming to webinars like this, or they're downloading reports from other companies, and they're absorbing themselves in research to understand how consumers are behaving and what they can possibly do. You've got 33% of companies saying we are actually being we're being somewhat or extremely innovative in our response to the pandemic. And I think that's super encouraging to think about. And 45% of people have told us that they're already developing plans and implementing them in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think it's really great news that not only are we planning, but we're also executing. So hopefully for a lot of companies they'll start to see the benefits of being able to move through. So I'm going to open up to a poll before I start the going through the research in particular. So with that in mind, we've got a situation where there's concerns over future ability for people to raise finance, and companies in uncertainty over the next few months, maybe potentially years. I wanted to understand how confident you're all feeling about the next 12 months at work. So as a poll, hopefully you should be able to see that. Based on some wonderful advice I was given last week, you might have seen, if you're unable to click on the button on the poll, you just need to minimize your screen, and then you should be able to use the radio buttons there. I'm just going to wait for a few more votes. Grand, that's nearly everybody voted. Brilliant. So I'll close it, and hopefully you should be able to see that. So there we go. So 53% saying somewhat confident, 6% saying extremely, 12% saying very confident. And on the other side of the scale, 24 saying not so. That's quite interesting. That's sort of a looking at, you've got the majority of people sort of somewhere in the middle, but the net effect, sort of combining those numbers up, is I'd say slightly more positive than in the middle. I was running another session earlier today where the results were quite similar. Majority of people felt somewhere in the middle, but the net effect was actually a little bit more negative. So that must mean that everyone comes on this webinar, is getting their stuff together and feeling confident about where they're going. Good on you. There we go. Should be able to hide that. Hopefully you should be able to see the screen, my slides. Please shout if you can't. You should be able to see some bars there. But thanks for voting. That's really interesting to see that type of result. But certainly lots of us somewhere in the middle, somewhat confident, which is probably not a bad thing. You don't want to be overconfident. In fact, research does say that if you're overconfident about something, it usually means you're less likely to be right about it, because it limits your ability to think about you get confirmation bias. You start to become quite kind of solidified in your perception about something, so less flexible to potential differences in outcomes. Anyway, less of the psychology. So I'm now going to talk to you about the latest data from this week, and there's some really interesting themes that are coming out. As you all know, for those who've been before, we're looking at understanding what people are looking forward to the most, and it's been super fascinating to see this over the last three weeks. And what we're seeing consistently is that people want to be able to spend time with their family, their friends. They want to be able to see their grandparents. And overall, we've seen this week 47% of people said they're most looking forward to seeing their family. But what's interesting is how that's grown. That was 32% only 2 weeks ago. So it's gone from 32 to 40 to 47. Clearly, people are pining to be able to spend time with their loved ones at this particular point. And maybe as the restrictions have been somewhat lifted, although the guidance is slightly unclear, people are really looking forward to being able to reconnect with others and experiences in more general. And for those of you who are in the travel sector, I think there's some quite positive rumblings coming through. So overall, in terms of what people are looking forward to, 2 weeks ago, we were at 4% of people said travel, and now we're seeing it's at 8%. So travel and holidays is something we're going to focus on a little bit in today's session. We've got some more data to share with you this week, just to kind of solidify some of the findings we have here. But overall, we're looking forward to seeing our family and being able to sort of move and travel and see things. That's really what's coming out. For those working more in consumer-based propositions like retail and things like that, we're seeing this week that it's not featuring in our top 10 mentions. It's still quite a small percentage of people. And I didn't present this last week, so I thought I'd just give you an update really in terms of the sense of community, which, if you remember, at the very start of the pandemic, we had people sharing lots of videos about how they're experiencing things on social media, and we're getting a lot of content from around the world and how other countries were coping with it. What we're seeing at the moment is that people are really looking forward to spending time with their family and their friends. Are still the top two things that they feel a sense of community towards. Over time, we've seen a downward trajectory for a sense of community with others around the world. In fact, it's now at its lowest level at 44%. So, what's the implication? I think this is really quite interesting. It certainly shows that, based on the data we've seen before, there's a real sort of social dimension to it, where people are looking forward to spending time with each other. I was rather surprised, I think, by seeing the sort of stark decrease here with a sense of community to your local area, because community action has been quite important over the last few months. And it might be, as people have been sort of very much focused in on their homes and able to move, that sort of suppressed it to some extent in recent weeks, as there's a feeling of kind of exhaustion to this whole process comes out. But it's going to be interesting to see. Certainly one theme that's coming out also is around sustainability, which I'll talk about later. And I think this sense of community spirit and sustainability are going to be two things that are going to be very, very important beyond the situation we're in. As I mentioned up front, the level of compliance is at its lowest level. So at the moment we're on 81%, and this was taken after the announcement by Boris Johnson about, whether we can stay at home or not stay at home. We're clearly seeing it's for some people, they've sort of decided that, I'm not really going to pay attention to these rules, and that, it sort of makes sense when you think about it, because 34% of people that we interviewed said that they found the government's message to be clear. In the case where you give unclear communication, people aren't going to behave in ways that you're intending, unless you're not really sort of intending to behave in a particular way. So I think that's very much coincided with the government's announcements, but also how people are feeling as well at the same time. Overall, their worry is still the main emotion that exists in the UK. So 41% of people currently feel worried. But this growing trend that I've mentioned before around a sense of restlessness and paradoxically a feeling of content are two emotions that also are featuring quite prominently in the UK. So you sort of got this really weird scenario where some people are just itching to get out and get back to doing stuff. And then you've got other people actually quite happy with the situation, quite enjoy the sort of I suppose the richness and experience of being able to kind of invest more at home with your family and your surroundings. Everybody, when you speak to people of all walks of life, has got a very different experience of this pandemic. It's not a consistent, unified picture for everybody, and that's very important to bear in mind longer term when you're looking at kind of customer segments and things like that. And when you look at the level of concern as well, there's a bit of a shift. Overall it's a subtle movement from those who were very worried and now just somewhat worried. So you're sort of seeing the middle tier of the kind of expanse between not at all concerned and extremely. You're seeing a bit of a shift in the middle around the centre. So overall, people are certainly the levels of concern do show some signs in the last 3 weeks of easing to some extent, but of course we are entering to very much unknown territory regardless of where we end up in the coming weeks and months. As I mentioned, this kind of rising community spirit, and over 50% of people feel a sense of community to their local area. We've talked a lot before about this kind of growing trend towards businesses who are being seen to be supportive or not supportive of their employees, benefiting or not benefiting from their response to the pandemic. So where if you're in a business that's seen to be supportive of its community and mindful of its treatment of employees, there's a real clear axis we can see in the perception data, was that they're more likely to succeed compared to those that don't. So and it's really interesting at a super kind of macro level on sustainability. That I was reading an article about analysts in the energy sector have said they believe that the only energy source that has performed well throughout this pandemic is actually renewables, because we've seen such fluctuations in crude oil and things like that, because people can't necessarily travel at the moment. Sustainability also is a huge term, of course, but it is very much associated with how we treat our employees, how we treat our suppliers, how we interact with a society at large, not necessarily our pure kind of environmental credentials. These two variables are consistently important variables when it comes to people making purchase decisions on goods and products, and it hasn't shown any sign of really depleting over the past few weeks. It's going to be important for us to monitor that over time, but historically you generally tend to see people are driven by price when they make kind of purchase decisions, or quality and customer care. And at the moment we're seeing that these two factors, sustainability and care for employees, rates really high. So it's really important for companies to get that right. And I wanted to talk to you about some of the more recent perception data we have. So we ask customers each week, how do you perceive different brands responding to the pandemic? Who's doing it well? Who's not doing it so well? Looking at the supermarket sector, these are the companies very much the sort of first port of call and first destination for people when we're told to just buy essentials only. overall, Tesco is the company that's coming out consistently performing better than others. And more recent weeks, it's announced that it's cutting the cost of petrol to 99.9 pence a litre, and diesel at 105.9 pence per litre. And they've committed to fixing that, which has coincided with an uptick in perception for them. The co-op's been very consistent in its messaging around its support for food banks. It's investing quite a lot in marketing in that as well. And you can see, I appreciate this slide's quite hard to kind of see, but you can see the orange line there for the co-op. Not their branded colours, I admit. But they're certainly investing a lot in that. Overall, we are seeing over time, until more recent weeks, a bit of a downward trajectory. But in more recent weeks, I think as people get used to the new ways we're going to have to interact with supermarkets, we're generally seeing evidence of an improvement in performance, certainly for a number of different companies. For retail, because I know quite a lot of people on the call today are from retailers, it's what we've seen is really a shuffling of the pack down the bottom end of perception. So when you ask consumers how good or bad different businesses' response has been to the pandemic, we're seeing that Top Man is down here. Burton, they've occupied the bottom two spaces for a couple of weeks, and in recent weeks we've seen more evidence of store closures and things like that. So there's obviously concern about local levels of employment in those particular areas. Whereas M&S at the top here I think they've realised, early on they're a bit slow off the mark to respond, but have been a bit more proactive with their more charitable endeavours in recent weeks, and they've, I think, benefited from that. So you've seen there in middle of April when they launched their food essentials box. That's when they sort of peak in terms of performance, and since then they've sort of struggled to sort of maintain and sustain that particular position. But there's been quite a lot written about concerns over their business performance. This week they unleashed onto the market a hand sanitizer for £11.50, which hasn't necessarily gone down particularly well. It's rubbed people up the wrong way, no pun intended. Let's see how many of these I can fit in. So that certainly had these kind of small, these kind of mistakes, we have seen have an impact on the perception of you as a business, not in terms of how good or bad your response has been, but also whether or not people feel like they can trust you as an organisation. So for all the good work that's been done before, it can backfire quite easily by sort of letting things slip a little bit, given the context we're in. And I think with all those macro trends, with people being less able to access their credit, potentially we've got more companies having to make people redundant rather than putting people on furlough with the uncertainty of the future, given they have to borrow more money to exist. With so much uncertainty that's around there, I think it's very important to be mindful of when we make these decisions, not to rub people up the wrong way. I just made the same joke twice. Compare that to Vodafone. So Vodafone are, from all the brands we're looking at, major brands that is, Vodafone are the worst performing. Those that we're measuring. I think what they've kind of got wrapped up into is not just in terms of the service level, so they've had the highest amounts of complaints over their service compared to any other telcos, but also quite kind of confusing messaging from them around when their 5G investment's going to pay off and when that's going to be implemented and working, and quotes from former employees, I think, that have confused people over time. But yeah, certainly they've not done particularly well throughout this process. In fact, there's a very strong correlation of 0.9 correlation between their response to the pandemic and the degree to which people feel that they can trust the business. So when we're looking at things like contract renewals and pay-as-you-go tariffs, the period we're in at the moment, when people are stuck at home and want to get in touch with people, the last thing you want is your internet to go, isn't it? I mean, it's pretty much everyone's source for life at the moment, I think, for a lot of people. So yeah, bit of a not necessarily a good score if I was being polite. So I'm going to talk to you about the different sectors in a bit more detail. But in terms of sort of summarising where we're at and what we've seen to date, in terms of how, what the UK is looking forward to, is even more the case this week than it has been previously, that we're really looking forward to spending time with our family. There's more evidence. It's doubled over the last 2 weeks in terms of people looking forward to being able to travel and go places, and recent announcements today by the government culture secretary that we might be able to start traveling again in July will just help alleviate those kind of concerns and make people feel a little bit more positive around what we're able to do. Of course, there are some concerns around that with safety, as you can imagine. And other themes that are coming out that we're obviously seeing around compliance and people's willingness to follow the government's guidelines will potentially have huge impacts on the long tail of our recovery to whatever position we find ourselves in the future. And certainly reputationally, we are continuing to see that those that are responding in a sensitive and empathic way are performing well compared to those that are more operationally focused and thinking about customers. So travel, this is one where there's just lots of activity and lots of interest. We get inquiries about latest sort of travel data, so we're covering it more in these sessions, following what's happening. Doesn't mean to say it's not relevant to everybody, because everything at the moment is connected, so it's very relevant across other sectors. What we have seen this week is that in terms of people's intention to spend more or less in the sector remains relatively steady compared to last week. So in terms of that potential investment here is consistent. Of course, remains to be seen when those measures are changed and people are able to travel. But what's really quite curious is looking at where people feel they would potentially like to travel. So we asked them, where is it you'd likely to want to go? Is it just in the UK? Would you consider UK and international travel, or just international travel on its own? I think what's been really quite curious about this is just seeing the 24% of people saying, actually, yeah, I would like to consider traveling overseas. All the concerns about safety and all the potential restrictions that we've seen proposed by not just the UK government, but internationally. For example, in Spain, they've put in measures last Friday which make it a little bit harder when you land into Spain to go about you have to go into a 2-week quarantine at the moment. There's still an appetite to discover and see and experience and do things, and it's very much in people's psyche. But it's really curious to see just the vast number of people who actually would say, I think I'm going to stay in the UK and keep it local and not go too far away from good old Blighty. When you look at how that spreads out demographically, so I was thinking to myself, well, where would you go, and thinking about the different demographics. So over here this is where people live. So you've got the southeast London, southwest, and all the different regions where their preferred destination if they were to travel in the UK. And it's quite an interesting pattern. It doesn't necessarily reflect a paucity of ambition on people. So I'll just be in defense of the respondents in this case. But it certainly shows that people are more inclined to go local, not to go too far, probably test out their experience of, if you've been stuck at home for 3 months, not being able to travel outside your county line, then it might sort of feel like a step too far to go beyond that. We're certainly seeing that to be the case across different regions. I was thinking, looking at the West Midlands is a really interesting one where I grew up, is that it's stay in the West Midlands. It is a wonderful place, can confirm that. The Southwest or Wales, which if you grew up in the Midlands in the 80s and 90s, they were very much the holiday destinations of choice. So there's sort of similar sort of patterns in terms of where people might go on holiday compared to where they would normally. So for anyone who works in destination marketing, there's potentially a bit of an opportunity for people who've been before. This would suggest that for 43% of the UK who are planning not to go abroad, then they probably likely to be going to the places they are familiar with. Obviously, we need to sort of do a bit more digging to say with any degree of absolute certainty, but it's difficult to be certain in a time like this. And given that they're willing to spend just as much as they would normally, we've not seen any evidence of their intention varying. You might benefit from their kind of annual travel budget as a result. So just something to think about for local services in those regions. You know, thinking about partnerships, tie-ups, and how you can really maximise that opportunity in your area. Now's the time to be collaborative, definitely. I wanted to share this as a really great example of a very simple innovation in a hotel in Sweden called Stat Hotel. They've got plenty of rooms that are currently unoccupied, and to make the most of their inventory, what they've done is create mini restaurants in their hotel space. Really smart idea. Probably cost a little bit to set that up, but probably not too considerable. But what it offers is it can accommodate between 2 to 12 people in a room, and people can order the food on their phone. It gets delivered outside the door, so you don't have this kind of issue of interacting with sales staff or holding a menu in your hand. It gets delivered in a kind of safe manner, and you can enjoy it in the comfort of your own private area. So I thought it was quite an interesting one to show, because it just demonstrates, again, it's just a case of reimagining things slightly. And what we have seen in our data is that if people are interested in family and experiencing things and going to destinations, then these could be the kind of tricks that people might want. These could be the kind of solutions people want to put in place to make people feel more comfortable when they come to your hotel or destination. Thinking about entertainment, the overall kind of summary for where we're at the moment, looking at the previous 10 weeks, it's reasonably consistent that we're seeing traditional media is performing well. So we're seeing quite a consistently high number of people saying they're reading books every day or every couple of days a week. Radio is also performing well, as is TV and music streaming, which is sort of traditional or kind of been fairly well established. So I don't know what they call that, somewhere in the middle, really. Been around for a while, certainly. But I think the kind of theme that's coming out really is that the traditional media hasn't died, and although you could be inclined to kind of read the latest news about the gaming sector or streaming services, but overall, yes, people are spending their time engaging in those types of services. But week on week, if you look at what people are doing every 3 days or more, you can see a fairly consistent pattern, actually, that they are reading books and watching TV shows, listening to the radio, particularly the sunshine that we've got at the moment. People might be less inclined to spend the time in front of the box. So it's really quite rich and quite diverse in terms of people's media habits. And I've talked about this before in these sessions about this kind of appetite for learning new skills. Well, again, it really is a theme that we're seeing consistently, and hasn't shown any sense of reducing with the good weather or when you have a change in season or a change in weather. Normally that does change behaviours quite dramatically in terms of people's intention to spend time inside, outside, the sort of things they pick up and do. Well, creative skills is one variable that's remained pretty consistent all the way through. So it does go to show that there's some real habit formation around this development. So something I think for lots of companies to be mindful of, whether, and the implication might be for those in education and training, to offer content, could be in publishers to be able to also offer content as well. For anyone in retail, providing access to those types of products could be, whilst we're seeing a depletion in apparel, then actually providing people with more access to things that are related to their hobbies and interests, but longer term might be a shrewd move into the future, into the unknown, I suppose. For grocery, the lead message here, the lead theme that's coming out, which is, I think we can start to say is a habit that is forming, is really around the use of online services. We've seen in previous weeks around 40 to 45% of people claiming they are doing their shopping for groceries using online retailers. This week we've seen that at 51. So it really is quite a movement now to where we're seeing almost say 51, you call that in the middle, right? The majority of people using these services to order products. So Longer term, what's the implication? Well, it's going to be very important. Obviously, for those retailers are going to see the benefit, but there's potential opportunities for people to gain presence on e-commerce platforms, pure play e-commerce platforms as well. Think about your channels and where you distribute yourself. This is an opportunity into the future to certainly consider. The initial barriers of putting in your card and being comfortable with spending money online, people have been forced into a situation where they have no choice. So I saw a joke actually online, which was, what's been the biggest driver of digital transformation in your company? And it had like the IT director's face, and it had no tick. And it had the CEO, it had no tick, and it had COVID-19 with a tick on the box. I thought, yeah, that's quite true actually. I think it's forcing lots of people into basically, taking the plunge. So with grocery, online is looks like it's the habit that's going to stick. In terms of new innovations, I think that are quite relevant in this sector, I came across this service recently called Our Streets, and effectively it's like a kind of community reporting tool where if you see someone driving ridiculously fast in your area, you can get on the app and say, look, I've seen this car, taking a picture of it, they're driving really fast, just be aware. Or if you've seen that there's any issues with kind of street services or anything in your local area, you can report it, notify other people, and it creates the idea is it creates community action around these things. They've flipped their model in more recent weeks actually to enable it as a crowdsourced mechanism, which is what it currently is in the communities, but around stock taking in grocery stores. So lots of smaller independent retailers don't have the ability to implement barcode scanners and do anything more sophisticated with technology. So it really limits their ability to say, look, these are our stock levels, this is what we've got. This is potentially an alternative where if enough people are using it, it means that businesses, people can be made aware of what stock businesses have in at that particular point, which can inform, how they, where they decide to go purchase when they're out and about. I think it's a really interesting idea. That has application not just for communities and groups at a local level, but also businesses as well that want to try to be able to communicate the availability of stock at that particular point. There's also something I saw which is probably more relevant in the kind of more traditional retail sector, which I didn't put in the presentation, but I should have done. I'll share it in the link afterwards, of a service where they are tracking the population density by a specific region. So how on Google you can see the peaks of when people visit. This does this in real time. So before you leave your house, you'll be able to see, the Sainsbury's up in Crystal Palace around the corner from me, which has often got a queue of 100 to 200 meters deep. There's no one there. I can go and actually pop in and get my shopping. So some really great innovations to kind of help people through the immediate problem, which longer term can be solutions for lots of companies to get access to the technology. I mentioned earlier that there's been a bit of a new skills, revolution with how people are spending their time, and there's been no better application than in the DIY and home category. And in fact, what we're seeing is that 13% of women and 10% of men are telling us that they learned a new homemaking skill last week. So it's not seeing again any evidence of the appetite for this growth in personal development and productivity showing any sign of reducing. It seems to be a habit that's certainly forming with time. So okay, why is that important? Well, it's important for anyone who's in that sector selling products, but it also has implications for retailers, publishers, and so on. It's really quite a big opportunity longer term. Certainly the change in the weather has encouraged people to go outside. So 45% of baby boomers have told us they're engaged in gardening activities nearly every day. This millennial's been doing it every day as well. So certainly a big appetite in these activities. And in terms of people's future intention to invest in this particular sector, it remains pretty static. So in terms of, we get the question of, what kind of things can we see that are sticking? If I was to be a betting person, I think this is certainly one that we're seeing you know, in gardening and home management and DIY, the ability to do it yourself and the satisfaction you derive from that has certainly been found around different houses in the UK. With retail, the overall message for this week is that overall engagement is not necessarily seeing an improvement compared to last week. There are some changes depending on the different verticals. Overall, the biggest opportunity seems to be if it's items related to hobbies and interests, which is kind of connected to some of the things I was talking about before. But items like clothing, sectors like apparel, aren't necessarily seeing the improvements that I think that particular market is looking for. And just comparing that week on week, we're seeing that you know, there is still a bit of a shift, 3% growth in people who are interested in buying gardening supplies week in, week out. But overall, we're not seeing anything, you know, significant enough to say that we're seeing a big recovery from that sector at the moment. And in terms of people's future intention to invest in that sector, remains relatively static compared to last week. So no real changes to observe there or to get excited about. With beauty, it's a similar sort of pattern, although there is something quite curious about the beauty sector, which I'll mention in a moment. Overall, we're seeing that just 9% of people report buying beauty products online last week, and there's certainly a youth opportunity. So 16% of Generation Z reported they bought beauty product in the last 7 days. So it indexes highly amongst the younger generation. It also seems to be indexing highly amongst those who are unconcerned about COVID-19. So we're seeing that there's a really curious dimension between those that self-report being concerned and those that self-report that they're not concerned about the COVID-19 pandemic. If you compare those two groups, so those that are concerned, those that aren't, what you're seeing is that those that are concerned, only 12% of them are saying they were looking for inspiration online last week, compared to 26% of people who tell us they're not really concerned about it. So there's clearly an attitudinal dimension to people's intention to engage in consumer categories, you know, be it just in form of content, but also in terms of their purchase decisions as well. So, you know, why is this important? It's important for a number of reasons. I think when we come to planning things out and the data you're using, that has historically for years frustratingly been this kind of focus on just demographic data and spend data, or using RFM modeling and things like that. We need to be a bit more sophisticated with our data collection and the types of information we're using to build up a picture about how people are feeling, with how confident they are, how they feel towards the COVID pandemic as well. So you probably want to start to play with more attitudinal data as well to get a sense of how things are evolving. And here it is, just kind of looking, you know, what we're seeing this week is that ultimately, in terms of the beauty sector, getting advice and inspiration sees the highest level of frequent engagement on an ongoing basis at the moment. When it comes to exercise, there was an announcement that, you know, we could now exercise twice a day, go out a little bit more. There's been some relaxation in the government guidelines there, but it hasn't necessarily translated to people, you know, getting on the starting blocks and legging it out the door. What we have seen is that this encouraged people to go walking more. So there's been a 5% increase in people who claim that they're likely to walk as a form of exercise at the moment. So it hasn't necessarily had such a big impact on this particular group. And in terms of people's future intentions to invest, remains relatively steady. Although I think you can observe a slight decrease. Again, whether the slide sort of stopped for you. 1 second. There you go. You should be able to see that. Sorry about that. Seems to be stuck. So you see a 3% shift in people's intentions to spend more since we started measuring it to now, so over 4 weeks. It has subsided. And I've mentioned before in previous webinars, one of the biggest barriers in the exercise sector is that people often don't feel confident enough to know what to do and how to invest in it. So that's a significant barrier that companies need to overcome. And in particular, if they're being told you can exercise twice a week, but they don't feel confident with going outside into the wider environment, doesn't necessarily mean say they're going to leg it out the door. They're going to be a little bit more careful. So I think that sort of backs up the kind of notion that once the lockdown measures have been, we start to see that sort of slow movement to people being more free with their movements and how they travel about. Doesn't seem at the moment that we're going to see a heightened fervour of activity to go too far away or do anything too outrageous, and that's because a lot of people are not necessarily, everyone has a different risk profile. Some people are more risk averse compared to others. For alcohol, it's a fairly consistent message this week again compared to last week, which is that we are seeing for people who are currently working are more likely to be consuming it on a regular basis compared to those that aren't currently working. And in terms of the generational split with kind of day-to-day behaviours, younger generations are more likely to be drinking with others via conferencing software, so catching up their mates down the virtual pub. They're also more likely to be exploring new tastes, new products, and exploring their palates a bit more than older generations, which is normally what you generally tend to see with purchase habits in grocery and those sort of verticals anyway. So it's fairly consistent. And what we've seen compared to last week, if we just take a snapshot at the moment, is it remains relatively steady in terms of daily habits. You've got 6% of people who are consuming alcoholic drinks with others each day, 6% of people who are doing it on their own each day, which is something for us all to be a little bit wary of at the moment. I thought it was quite curious looking at this, is just how we can sometimes, I think, in the marketing and product innovation world, get quite excited about new innovations and new ideas. I thought it was fascinating to see just how many people are producing their own drinks at the moment, and again, it's a new skill development, doing something with their spare time, compared to ordering drinks using on-demand services. So, again, what's the opportunity? We focus a lot on, what's the latest tech innovation that consumers are engaging with. But actually, there's some really, beer's been around for a very long time. But there's some really old school, traditional behaviours that are, seeing just as much of an engagement as some of the more recent ones, and we've seen that in entertainment. So I think there's an encouragement from me to people to say, think about some of the slower moving categories. They might not necessarily be as sexy, but they're certainly seeing quite a bit of engagement. So yeah, it's interesting to sort of see where we're at. Since the announcement from a couple of weeks ago, we've seen that the confusion over messaging has led to some people saying, I'm going to go my own way, I'm going to do my own thing. And 1 in 5 people, telling us that they're not following the government guidelines is a cause for concern and will have an impact on health, society, and some of our local services. And we're going to we'll see the impact of this in potentially soon, but we'll see. We're into the unknown territory, I suppose. In terms of people's sense of community, they're really looking forward to spending time with their family and their friends. We have seen this kind of global appeal of sense of community with others around the world continues to drop, and it's at its lowest level this week. And I think that's probably due to people feeling a little bit jealous about the state of play here in the UK compared to other countries. Reputationally speaking, some brands are performing much better than others and being more mindful of things, but it's very easy to let for a slip up to become quite a public scandal. So just be mindful of that. We know that in terms of people's drivers of choice, environmentalism and sustainability, which are these are kind of themes that we're being asked more about. We will be investigating a bit more in the coming weeks and bringing out to these sessions for you to have a better understanding of. And in terms of the categories, the habits that we are certainly, I've been very reticent to talk about, new habits that we might see beyond the pandemic, because we really don't know where we're heading. But if I was to put a bet on something, and I'd be willing now to say, well, I think in new skill development, online grocery shopping and e-commerce certainly certainly we're not seeing any real changes to those activities with change in weather and other circumstances at the moment. And traditional media is still just as important as more newer forms as well. So what's coming next? We're actually going to have a break. We're going to have our next webinar be on the 4th of June. We're mindful of there being a bank holiday and a little bit of webinar exhaustion for lots of people. We will still publish our research next week, so we will be putting that up on our website and we will be distributing that around to you. As lots of you know, you can download the latest report on our website. We were kind of stuck for last week we rebranded the whole business. As you might have seen, the slides look very different, which did lead to a slight delay getting last week's report up, but it's now up on the website should you choose to do that. So if there are any questions, I'll just open up for the last 5 minutes, see what there is. So the first question that comes in, is there a difference in demographic for those that want to travel within the UK and those who want to holiday abroad? Great question. Yes, we have the data. I didn't put it in the presentation. Let's have a chat after this, and I'm sure we can supply you with something of interest there. But there certainly seems to be quite a difference. There seems to be quite a kind of interesting 24% versus 46% is quite a stark contrast in different groups. So yes, we do have that available to look at. So the next question is, have you got any more data on sustainability? I'm looking at information around how people feel about their community action in their local area. Sustainability is one we're getting more requests for. We're looking at it at the moment in terms of people's as a kind of purchase driver and seeing where that's a variable that is moving. As it stayed quite static, I had a conversation today with a business. They're asking us to do to present for them at a conference in a couple of weeks, and sustainability is something that's coming out a lot from the logistics sector. So we're going to be looking at we're going to be focusing on sustainability in the next couple of weeks. So if you bear with us, we can certainly get something. We'll have something to share in the coming weeks. We're actually next week, as well as all the usual kind of updates, we'll also be focusing on families in particular next week, as potentially people will be going back to maybe going back to school. We'll see. I think they're the main questions coming through. I'm quite mindful of time, so unless there's any other kind of burning issues, it is a Thursday before the bank holiday, so I'm sure most of you are probably thinking about getting outside, getting a G&T or something. So thanks very much for attending, and we'll see you on the 4th of June at 11 AM. I'll be sharing the slides and an invite to that after this session. And in the meantime, have a wonderful bank holiday and remember to rest up and relax. See you later.